A lot of things have changed in the latest Next.js app router. So with React server components, the line between server and client have blurred and many other things have changed. So in this video, I want to talk about how to structure or how to architect your Next.js applications. So this is actually a wonderful article about security in Next.js by Sebastian Markbaga. And this is an article about security in Next.js. And here you can see they actually recommend using a so-called data access layer for your new project. In this video, I'll show you what that means. But for example, we want to make sure that we do an authentication check before we actually interact with our database. And there's a certain way that we can structure our application, make sure we do that. So what's the problem? Why do we need something fancy like a data access layer? What even is that? Well, let's say we have a very simple project. I just have a home page here, and that's what we have here, h1, and read an article, right? So this whole project just has one article. I can go to the article page, and here I have some text. This is actually data, right? When it comes to security, what do we want to protect? What do we want to secure? It's our data, right? Our data is the most important part. If we render the wrong button or the markup isn't right, that's not the end of the world typically. But if this article text specifically, if this should only be viewable for logged in users, maybe even paid users, then we want to make sure that this text here cannot be read by guest users or free users. So what I'm doing here is I'm using a React server component, right? This is a page component, and by default, everything in the Next.js app router is essentially a server component. I can do async await, and this is how you get data in the idiomatic way in the latest Next.js app router, right? You can do it directly here in the server component. You don't need useEffect. You don't need an API route or route handler either. You also don't need a server action. You can do it directly like this. Okay, so in my database, I just have one article. I'm using Prisma here, and you can see here in my database, I just have this one simple article here. That is what I'm getting, and that is the text that I'm showing here. So that's what we have so far. Now, what's the problem with this? So we want to make sure that only logged in users, let's say, can actually read this text. So what you could do is simply add some protection to this whole page, right? So you could use an authentication solution. So we're going to use Kind in this video. They are today's sponsor, and they have in my view, a great solution for authentication. The way it works with Kind is you can do something like this. And now when this page loads, we're first going to do an authentication check, right? So then before you even get anything from the database, you first have the auth check. In this case, this would work. But with React server components, we can also fetch data in another component, right? So here we were fetching the data right here in the article page, but maybe we are fetching that in some component. Maybe we have a dedicated component for the text, right? Which actually kind of makes sense. And in there we do the data fetching, and we then return the actual text, right? So then we would use that component, right? Every React developer has components on their mind. So maybe you or somebody else on your team structures it like this, where we actually access the data in a separate component. Now this is risky with server components, because now it's still protected, right? We're still first doing the authentication check before we render this component and before we actually get the data from the database. But what React developers also have front of mind is reusability. So what if somebody on your team reuses this component on the homepage, let's say, right? So maybe somebody's going to use it on the homepage. Here we do not have an authentication check. So now if I go to the homepage, I can view this data or whatever, right, which is not what we want. And by the way, it doesn't matter how you protect your pages, whether it's actually like this in a page component, or instead maybe you're using middleware. We can also use middleware with Kind, right? It would look something like this. They have the with auth, and we want to run this on the /article route. But this only protects the /article route. But I just added this component on the homepage, which is a public route, right? So here we are still accessing that, well, what should be private data, right? So it doesn't matter what way of protecting you use, as long as there is a gap between where you do the authentication and where you actually access data from your database. There is a gap, and that gap allows for, well, potentially dangerous. And here I show you an example of getting data. But this problem also is with updating data with server actions, right? So server actions are the idiomatic way of updating data. Now server actions, they live on the page, the route on which you're using them. So if you're using a server action on the /article route, you may think, oh, middleware, I'm going to protect the /article route, so the server action I'm using there is going to be protected. Well, what if somebody's using that server action on a public route on the homepage, let's say, right? So this way of protecting your app at the middleware level or at the page level like this is not enough. And so instead, you may want to use a data access layer. Now, before I show you the solution, I quickly removed what we just did, and I quickly will show you how to set up kind, and then we'll take a look at the data access layer. We don't even have any kind of authentication, right? So everybody can just go here. It's a public page right now. So we need to add some authentication. So let's start it there, and then I'll show you how to structure it. So I'm going to use kind for the authentication. They are today's sponsor, and I'm actually a brand ambassador for them. It's a paid sponsorship, but I had a great time working with them so far, and they have a very generous free tier here as well. You can find a link in the description if you want to sign up right now. If you sign up, you can easily add an application. I will quickly add authentication with them so you can see how that works. But everything that we're going to talk about here also works with any other authentication solution you may be using. So here I just need to quickly add some name. I'll call it Next.js app, a backend web here. Next.js is very backend heavy, so it's actually more of a backend framework. So here they have a template here for Next.js. Okay, easy. All right, so then here they show you exactly existing code base, how to implement this. So yes, it's running on localhost 3000. I just have to set these to callback URLs here in kind. Boom, boom. All right, then I can install their Next.js package. Can just copy and paste that right here. All right, and then let's see, we need to add some environment variables. I'm gonna quickly create .env.local and just paste that right here. And actually here, after logging in, where do we want to redirect the user? Well, in this case, let's actually redirect them to that article page. So that's the only thing I will change here. All right, so then last step here, we need to add the API endpoint so that kind can internally wire everything up. And actually, I should be able to just copy the path. And then here, I should be able to create a new file by just pasting everything like this. Yeah, and here we need to just copy and paste that right here. All right, so that's all we need to do to add authentication to our Next.js app with kind. And then here they show you login and log out buttons. We're not going to use that here, but we do want to protect this article page now. So what we can do with kind, we can go to that page. So what we can do is, if we want to protect this article page, well, when it renders, we can simply check the authentication status of the user. So kind gives us this get kind server session that we can use everywhere on the server side. This is a server component, so we can use it. It will give us an is authenticated function actually. So I do need to call it here. So if the user is not authenticated, we are going to redirect them to that API route so kind can take care of logging the user in. And if the user is authenticated, we continue here and we actually are going to make that fetch call to our database through our ORM using Prisma here, but works similarly for other ORMs. And that will give us some data here. And so we can just take its text, and that's what we would see then. Now here, I'm actually already being redirected here. So if I click on read article, I'm not logged in. So indeed, I should be redirected, right? And indeed, kind is redirecting me to a login page. Now here, we do need to specify how we want the user to log in. So we can go to authentication here, and kind gives us these options. Now what we want to use is just GitHub here. I'm going to save that. Now if I try going to that article page again, all right, so here we have continue with GitHub. I'll quickly log in, and now here I'm redirected. Now if I go to inspect here under cookies, and if I go here, yeah, so here under access token, I can see so I'm logged in, and therefore I can see the article page with that, well, protected data, right? That's why I can now see that, right? So this is a very quick way of securing our page for only logged in users. You don't want to do it in layout, right? So if you've watched my other videos on authentication in Next.js, you know that you typically don't want to add it to the layout here. It's very tempting to do this if you want to protect your whole app, right? Because you think, oh, instead of doing it on every page, we're just going to do it once in the layout. But that will not work as expected, because the layout here will not it's not going to run this if you, for example, click on this link like here, right? When we navigate here, it's not going to redo the check for the article page. So you don't want to do it in layout. You want to do it either in the page component, or you can also create a middleware. They both have certain advantages. But let's say we do it like this. Now, what's the problem with this? I have now properly protected this. So what's the issue with this? You can see we get the same result, but we have just refactored this a little bit. So we have a dedicated component for the text. In a real Next.js app, you could very well have a separate component where you actually get the data. And this is the important part, because now there is more of a gap, right? So here now we are doing the authentication check, but where we actually access the database is now in a separate place, right? It's in a separate component here, right? So far so good, but React developers also have reusability at the top of their mind, right? So there could be you or some other developer on your team could accidentally perhaps use this component on the homepage, right? So I could also use text here on the homepage. If I do it here on the homepage, we now have this text here on the homepage. So even if I log myself out by clearing all of my cookies here, so I don't have the token anymore, since the homepage is not protected, right? We don't have any authentication check here, and I'm not logged in, I can still read this, right? So this text here, this piece of data that we have that should be protected is not protected right now, right? Now the article page is still properly protected, but the home page is public. So if you use that component on the home page, right? So it doesn't matter if you use middleware or you do the authentication check directly in the page, right? Let's stick to the page for this tutorial. This problem exists with both approaches. I have other videos also with kind when to do the authentication check in the page or when in middleware. It depends a little bit on your setup, but let's continue with doing it in the page for this video. So how do we fix this? How can we prevent this? So this is where the concept of a data access layer comes into play. So what we want to do is we want to have one centralized place or layer in our application where we interact with our database, right? So our data. So what you could do is you could create a folder here for all your data access, right? We can actually just call it data access. And in here, we can create a file. This is going to be for the articles, right? So for the article table in our database, let's say. And here I will have all of the ways that I'm going to interact with my article data. So here I could export a function that I can just call getArticle, right? I could accept some ID or something like that, but let's keep it simple. And here is where I'm going to get the data, right? So what we were doing previously, somewhere in our application, somewhere in our component tree, we now know for sure that all of the data is going to come from here. I will just return that from here. This one function is going to be responsible for getting the article. All of the data access is going to be in here. So this is for getting an article. Maybe we are going to have one for update article, right? All of your CRUD, delete article. We can, right? These are now empty, but you get the point. All of the interactions with your database, you're going to create functions in here. You can also do it with a class. If you're a backend developer, you may already be familiar with the concept of a data access layer, but a lot of you are actually coming from the front end world. So basically what we're doing here is we're creating a centralized place where we do all the data access, basically all our interactions with our database. So now whenever you need data in your application somewhere, you're not going to randomly do that in some component. Right, so here we're not going to get the article data from here now because we have one function now for getting the article. And so whenever we need to get an article, we're going to use that function, right? So now if I want to get article data, I can say article data, and now I need to use that function, right? Get article, I should import that. And I get a red squiggly line here, by the way, because Prisma tells me it could also be null, right? I may have deleted it in the database. I'm ignoring that here, but I can remove Prisma now from here, right? So now I can access this data in the text component. Now, since we're always going to use this function now when we need to get an article, we can do the authentication check in here. So we can just do all of this with kind right here, right? So you first do the auth check and then you interact with the database. And the benefit is now I can safely use this getArticle function wherever I want, whether it's in this component or in some other component. And I can be rest assured that the authentication check is always being done because there's no gap now between the authentication check and the place where I'm accessing my database, right? So there's no gap in here. They're right after each other. They're right in the same function. So that is in essence the benefit of using a data access layer. It's safer in my view, because now whenever I need to get the article, I just use that one function which takes care of all the authentication and potentially authorization logic. So I can now more comfortably work here in my application. Now I may still want to have a page level check as well, maybe more of as a convenience, perhaps as a way to quickly do some redirections at a page level, let's say, or just to see what pages should be public or private, right? So that would be like your first line of defense, whether you're doing some kind of page level check or middleware check, that would be like your first line of defense. And then in addition to that, whenever you need to get access to a piece of data, in this case, a particular article, it could be other data that you have, you're going to create a separate function for that in your data access layer, right? Basically just one file right now, in which you also do the authentication check so that you're always certain that the interaction with the database is safe. Right? Data access layer is not an API or an external API or something like that, right? So you may be inclined to use like an API layer to fix that issue, but that's not necessary. When you're using an API, you're actually going over the network. There are other complications that come from that. Instead, we can just structure our application code slightly differently so that every interaction with your database is now going to be in this one folder. Let's say this is just, we can call it a layer. You can call it however you want. And we could have one file per table or schema in our database, right? So here I'm using Prisma, and here I just have this one model for article. This will create one table in my database. And so you may want to have one file for each one you have. In this case, I only have article. And so here you would do your authentication check right before the actual database call. And we would do the same for the other potential functions here, right? So if you want to update the article, maybe you would have some kind of database call like this, right? Maybe you pass in an ID or something like that. But here again, you would first do your authentication check before you interact with the database. So now wherever in your app where you need to update the article, you need to make sure that you only use this function, and then you can be rest assured that there's always the authentication check first, right? So now only logged in users can update an article. You know, realistically, you're going to have other authentication authorization rules, right? So maybe every logged in user can actually get an article, but to update an article, you need to be an admin or something like that, right? So here you can have additional rules if the user is not an admin. Kind has a great solution for roles and permissions as well. We can check if the user has the proper role or permission. So that's another benefit of using this structure is now whenever you need to change your authentication or authorization logic, you know where to look. Because previously, if you were doing the authentication check in some, random components throughout your code base, you don't know exactly where you left that check, right? So now you want to update the authorization logic so that only admins can update articles. So now you have to think, oh, where did I leave that? Where did I leave that logic? Was it in the text component or some other component, right? So it's scattered throughout your code base, but this way you know where to look. It's all in your data access folder. You have embedded that within these functions. All of the updates happen in one place. Also, if you work in a team, you may have one person who takes care of the data access layer and another person and that actually uses that in the rest of the app, right? So I think it also helps split up the work. I think somebody who is a traditional back-end developer would feel more at home interacting with the database than a traditional front-end developer, right? So a front-end developer would probably feel more comfortable actually using these functions. So I think this is a more natural way of splitting up the work in a team that's working on a Next.js app. It also helps in other related ways. For example, if you want to log who's accessing the database, the access, or you're doing some kind of security audit, you can just do it directly in here. You know where to do it. It's all in one centralized place, right? So there are many benefits that come with this structure. The fancy word for this is a data access layer, and you can implement it in different ways. You can use classes, but this is now the recommended structure for accessing your data in new Next.js projects. Use here as well. In addition to that, you may also want to use the server-only package. It will make sure that if you try accessing anything here on the client side, that you will get an error. So it's slightly safer so that you're not accidentally trying to use these functions on the client side. And what you may also want to do is if you're using an ORM like Prisma here, there are some other security best practices, I would say, because very often you don't need all of the article data, right? So with Prisma here, I can select what I want. So here I want the text, for example, but maybe this article in the database also has the author email, right? And that is more sensitive data, right? So somebody's email is not something that we loosely want to pass around. Now, by default, if you leave the select off, right, if you just do it like this, it will give you all the fields of that article. But by using select here, we can make sure that we only get the text fields back and not the email, right? So we can be more specific and get back just the fields that we need and not the more sensitive, perhaps, fields, right? So that's another, I would say, security best practice, right? Also, if you're actually managing users in your own database, you don't want to get their hashed passwords, right? So you don't want to select the password in that case. Now, let's say we are getting the data like this. So we are getting the article data from the database and we are returning it plainly like that. Now, before we actually return that and sort of make it available to the rest of our app, wherever we may be accessing, wherever we may be trying to use that, maybe we sort of want to do one last filter step. Or now you may want to be a little bit more specific. So instead of just returning the whole article data like that, maybe we actually do want to pass and make available a specific object, right? So we know that article data has an ID. So maybe we do indeed want to return that ID, okay? And also the text, right? So article data.text, okay? So we are now returning essentially the same. Now, if article data also had that author email, right, you could decide to not include it here. Right, so here in this case, you can also say, well, we're simply not going to return that from here. Right? That's another way of sort of filtering out sensitive fields. Also, maybe you can already do some data transformations here or do some computation here. For example, the slug, if it for whatever reason is not part of the article data from the database, maybe the slug, right? So that's typically the title of the article in the URL. Maybe we can just take the article data, the text, and then just maybe take the first 10 characters or something like that, so that it's easier to use it in the rest of the app. Right? Basically, the fancy word for this is a data transfer object, a DTO. And so instead of doing it like this, we may actually create a function that actually does that for us. Right? So here we can say create article DTO, and you pass in the article data, and that's what we're going to return here. Let me actually just create that function here. Create article DTO, which takes in that article data and it returns an object with an ID, the tag. We came up with some slug example as well. Right, so here it's basically a way of filtering out sensitive fields and maybe do some transformations on some data, basically making sure that it's the exact shape that we want, because what you get back from the database may not be the exact shape in which you want to use it in the rest of your application. That's what we would return. Now, basically, we get the data and the raw data from the database, and we just shape it a little bit before we return it from that function, before we're actually going to use it in the rest of the application. We may want to create a separate file where you have these DTO. Another benefit of this is, for example, if you change the model in your database, right? So maybe here I'm going to change the schema actually here for Prisma. Instead of text, maybe we actually rename this to content, let's say. The benefit is now that we don't have to update that everywhere in our app, right? So previously, if you were just using the raw object from the database, you would have to update it in every place. But now we are also centralizing that here in one place. So we can keep using text as long as we, of course, change this into content, right? So then in the rest of the app, we can still use article data.text, right? So we would still use article data.text here. But now it is .content from the database, right? So now I would say this is becoming pretty sophisticated setup in the latest Next.js app router. Next.js is a full stack framework, so we are sort of rediscovering a lot of traditional software engineering concepts. But I would say this is a better structure than randomly accessing your data throughout your component. This is something that you may want to use, or at least to think about, right? So here we were talking about getting data, fetching data from your database, but the same problem will exist, update data in a database in a server action, and actually for very similar reasons. You may be confused a little bit because this is all pretty cutting edge, but the good news is for authentication and authorization, which used to be a huge problem, at least that part of the stack has been solved thanks to Kind. Kind makes it really easy to manage all of the authentication, authorization stuff. So I would say check out Kind. I want to thank them for sponsoring this video. Very easy to set up, very professional looking. You can find a link for them in the description. And I want to thank you for watching as well. Hope to see you in the next one. Bye.